In the spring of 1944, Japanese naval intelligence sat down to count what the Americans had floated. The number that came back stopped them cold. A single class of warship, the Essex-class, was already producing fleet carriers faster than the Empire of Japan had built any carrier, of any kind, in the entire war. The math was finished before the next battle began. The irony was that, on the morning of December 7, 1941, Japan held the better hand at sea. The Imperial Navy had 10 carriers in service or near commissioning, the most modern naval air force in the world, and crews drilled to a fanaticism the Americans could not match. The U.S. Pacific Fleet had 3 carriers in the theater and a tangle of obsolete biplanes. For 6 months Japan rode that lead Pearl Harbor, Wake, Java, the Indian Ocean raid. Then at Midway, 4 Japanese carriers burned in a single morning, and the calendar took over. By the end of 1942, the United States Navy had lost the Lexington at Coral Sea, the Yorktown at Midway, the Wasp to a Japanese submarine off Guadalcanal, and the Hornet at Santa Cruz. 4 of its 7 pre-war fleet carriers were on the bottom of the Pacific in 7 months. At one point in late October 1942, after Santa Cruz, the U.S. Navy had a single operational fleet carrier in the entire Pacific theater, USS Enterprise, herself damaged, limping back to Noumea for repairs. A Japanese admiral with up-to-date intelligence might have concluded that month that the war was won. He would have been looking at the wrong ledger. What Japan had not understood and would never recover from was already on the ground in 5 American shipyards. The first Essex-class carrier, the lead ship, had been laid down on April 28, 1941, more than 7 months before Pearl Harbor. Her keel was a hedge by a navy that had been quietly drawing up bigger, more aggressive carriers since the late 1930s. The design that emerged was not a refinement of the pre-war Yorktown class. It was a war machine. 27,000 tons standard displacement. A flight deck nearly 900 feet long, longer than the Empire State Building was tall. Room for between 90 and 100 aircraft, depending on the model. A novel deck-edge elevator that did not interrupt flight operations when it was in motion. An armored hangar deck, 12 5-inch guns, dozens of 40mm Bofors mounts, and an electronic suite that grew through the war to include the latest radar. It was, on paper, the carrier the Pacific would be decided by. The only question was how fast it could be built. The answer came in steel. Newport News, Virginia laid down the first one, then Bethlehem Steel at Fall River, Massachusetts, then the New York Navy Yard at Brooklyn, then Norfolk, then New York Shipbuilding at Camden, New Jersey. 5 yards in 5 separate cities, all building the same ship at once. The Navy had ordered 24. By the time the war ended, 24 had been built, and 14 had reached the fleet in time to fight. The lead ship, USS Essex, was commissioned on December 31, 1942, 20 months after her keel was laid. Workers had cut the construction time of the pre-war Yorktown class in half. They were not finished cutting. By 1944, some yards were delivering Essex-class hulls in 17 and 18 months. The pace was not accidental. The U.S. Navy's Bureau of Ships had spent 1939 and 1940 standardizing the Essex drawings down to the rivet, distributing them as a single master plan to every cooperating yard, and prefabricating sections inland that arrived at the slipway ready to weld into place. Engine rooms, gun mounts, even kitchens were assembled in factories in Pittsburgh and Cleveland and shipped east by rail. The hulls themselves rose in pre-cut subassemblies, bow sections, stern sections, hangar deck modules that came together like the body panels of an automobile. The Japanese yards at Yokosuka and Kure, by contrast, were still laying carriers down rib by rib, with each ship treated as a custom job. The difference was not skill, it was system. What followed was a launching cycle that no other navy on Earth could match or even approach. USS Yorktown, the second of the class named for the lost Midway carrier, joined the fleet in April 1943, then Intrepid in August, Lexington again in February, Bunker Hill in May, Hornet again in November, Wasp again in November, then Franklin, Hancock, Bennington, Boxer, Antietam, Randolph, Shangri-La, names that filled the gaps left by the carriers Japan had killed in 1942 and then went on to crowd the gaps with more. 3 of the new carriers carried the same names as the 3 sunk at Coral Sea, Midway, and Santa Cruz. Tokyo had announced the deaths of those original ships in 1942 with formal communiques. By 1943, the same names were back at sea, on newer, larger, more capable hulls, and the Imperial Navy had no way to sink them faster than the Americans could build them. By the first months of 1944, the United States Navy had as many new fleet carriers operational in the Pacific alone as the Imperial Japanese Navy had launched of any kind, anywhere, since the Sino-Japanese War. While the American keels piled up, Tokyo was trying to answer them with a single ship. Her name was Taiho. She was Japan's only purpose-built fleet carrier commissioned during the entire Second World War. Laid down in July 1941, just months after Essex, she did not enter service until March 1944, 32 months from keel to commissioning against Essex's 20. Taiho was a fine design on paper. She carried an armored flight deck, the first in the Japanese fleet, 65 aircraft, the speed and endurance to keep up with the fast carrier force. She represented the standard the Imperial Navy would have to meet to stay in the war. She lasted 3 months. On June 19, 1944, in the opening hours of the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the American submarine USS Albacore put a single torpedo into Taiho's bow. The hit ruptured a fuel line. Hours of poor damage control filled the great new carrier with aviation gas vapor. A spark from a generator finished the job. Taiho exploded and went down, and with her went any realistic chance of replacing the carriers Japan was losing on the same day. By nightfall, Shikaku, one of the veterans of Pearl Harbor, had been sunk by another American submarine, the Kavala. The converted liner Hiyo was sunk by aircraft the next day. The Imperial Navy's carrier-borne air arm did not survive the battle. American pilots called it the Marianas Turkey Shoot. They downed roughly 600 Japanese aircraft against the loss of about 123 of their own, most to fuel exhaustion in the dark. The American carriers in that fight were not a handful of veterans. There were 15 U.S. fleet carriers in the formation. 6 of them were Essex-class, the lead ship Essex herself, plus Hornet, Yorktown, Bunker Hill, Wasp, and Lexington. The 7th Fleet carrier was the older Yorktown-class Enterprise, the last survivor of the pre-war carriers. They were supported by 8 light fleet carriers of the Independence class, themselves a wartime improvisation, converted from light cruiser hulls, and by the hundreds of land-based and escort carrier aircraft of the supporting force. The math of the day before mattered less than the math of the calendar. While Taiho burned, 2 more Essex-class were being commissioned that summer. 2 more were in fitting out. 6 more were on the ways. The fighters those carriers launched were a story of their own. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat, designed in 11 months in 1941 and 1942, around what the Navy had learned from captured A-6M-0s, had entered service in early 1943, and by the Philippine Sea was the standard Pacific Fleet fighter. Its pilots had been trained on the largest naval aviation expansion program in history, the Aviation Cadet Training Program, which ran through Pensacola, Corpus Christi, and the Great Navy Field at Glenview, Illinois, and which by 1944 was graduating new combat pilots at a rate the Japanese could not begin to match. The Hellcats off the Essex-class decks at the Marianas claimed roughly 15 Japanese aircraft for every Hellcat lost. The kill ratio had been earned in part by the pilots, and in part by an industrial base that could afford to give every one of those pilots 300 hours in the air before he met the enemy. Tokyo had seen the storm building and had tried to outrun it. In the panic that followed Midway, the Imperial Navy authorized a new line of carriers called the WWII class, 3 semi-fleet ships, smaller and cheaper than Taiho, that could be slipped through the yards in time to matter. The keels were laid on August 1, October 1, and December 8, 1942. They did not save anything. WWII entered service in August 1944 and was sunk in December by the American submarine USS Redfish on her first major mission. Amagi entered service the same month and was bombed apart at Kure Naval Base in July 1945 before she could carry an air group into combat. Katsuragi was completed in October 1944 and never operated a single sortie of aircraft. By then there were no aircraft and no trained pilots left to fly off her. 3 carriers laid down in panic, 3 carriers wasted. Japan tried one more answer. In the months after Midway, the Imperial Navy looked at the unfinished hull of a Yamato-class superbattleship sitting in dry dock at Yokosuka and decided to make a carrier out of it. The result was Shinano, at 65,000 tons standard, the largest aircraft carrier ever built in the world, a record that would stand for nearly 2 decades. Shinano was commissioned on November 19, 1944. 10 days later, on the night of November 28, the American submarine USS Archerfish put 4 torpedoes into her starboard side as she steamed for Kure to receive her air group. The new carrier rolled over and sank that morning, taking with her some 1,400 sailors and the last serious Japanese attempt to put a new fleet carrier into the Pacific War. She had been afloat for 10 days. She had never embarked in aircraft. Her own engineers had not finished sealing her watertight compartments before she sailed. Across that same 10 days, the Newport News shipyard kept welding. The American factory floor was what the Japanese could not match, and what every senior Japanese officer who lived past 1944 admitted, in post-war interrogations, they had counted on not facing. 5 shipyards in 5 different cities, 3 shifts running through the night, prefabricated hull sections delivered by rail and rolled onto the ways by cranes that were themselves built for the job. Behind the shipyard stood the merchant marine, the steel mills, the oil refineries, the rubber plants, and the schools turning out aviators by the thousand. By the late summer of 1944, the United States Navy was training more new naval aviators every month than the entire Imperial Japanese Naval Air Service still had on its rolls. The shipyard workers themselves were a piece of the picture the Japanese had not seen and could not duplicate. At Newport News, the welders and electricians and pipefitters working on the Essex-class hulls included women hired in the thousands beginning in 1942, the same labor pool that lit the Liberty shipyards on the Pacific coast and the bomber plants at Willow Run. Bethlehem Fore River drew labor up from Boston, the Bronx, Rhode Island, and the Maine coast. The crews worked 4 10-hour shifts a week. They did not stop for snow or rain. They went into the hulls in winter wearing coats over coveralls, with chalk lines marked on the plate steel by the day's foreman, and they came out at the end of a shift 40 pounds lighter than they had been 6 months earlier. The yards posted daily output on chalkboards by the gate. The men and women coming off shift checked the number and went home. What the chalkboards measured was tonnage. What they did not measure was the second-order machine the tonnage made possible. Every new Essex-class carrier required its own air group, roughly 100 aircraft, 300 to 400 aircrewmen, mechanics, ordnancemen, radio operators, and yeomen. The U.S. Navy and Marine Corps stood up new air groups at training bases in Glenview, San Diego, Pensacola, and Jacksonville at the same pace the yards were launching the hulls. When USS Hancock was commissioned in April 1944, Carrier Air Group 7 was already trained and waiting to embark. When USS Bennington was commissioned in August, Carrier Air Group 82 reported aboard within weeks. The Imperial Japanese Navy was watching its experienced pilots die faster than it could train new ones. The Japanese Training Command had been reduced by 1944 to graduating new pilots with as little as 100 hours of flight time. The Americans, with their carriers and their air groups arriving in matched pairs, were graduating theirs with 300 hours and rising. The Japanese student pilot of 1944 met the American carrier pilot of 1944 in the air over the Philippine Sea. The result was a slaughter. Behind the air group stood the supply train. Each Essex-class carrier in a forward operating area consumed roughly 2,300 tons of fuel oil, 400 tons of aviation gasoline, and 90 tons of food, ammunition, and stores per week. To keep Task Force 58 fed and fueled at the front, the U.S. Navy built and operated, by mid-1944, the largest mobile logistics fleet in human history, Service Squadron 10. A floating base of oilers, ammunition ships, hospital ships, and repair ships that moved with the fast carrier task force from anchorage to anchorage across the Pacific. The Japanese had nothing equivalent and would never build it. A captured Japanese staff officer, interrogated by the U.S. Navy in 1945, reportedly said that what astonished him most about the American fleet was not the number of carriers, but the fact that they never seemed to need to go home. Japanese intelligence reports surviving from that period are remarkable for their honesty. The officers writing them did not pretend the empire could win a building race. They wrote about American shipyard output in the same tone a chess player uses to describe a losing endgame. The position is what it is. Here is the count. Here is what remains. What remained on the American side was a carrier force that could project 500 aircraft from a single task group, Task Force 58, at a stretch of ocean of Tokyo's choosing. Task Force 58 in the summer of 1944 numbered 7 fleet carriers, 8 light carriers, 8 fast battleships, and dozens of cruisers and destroyers. It was, in effect, the largest single concentration of naval air power in human history. It had not existed 3 years earlier. It had been built in the time it took Taiho to be laid down, completed, and sunk. By the spring of 1945, USS Bonhomme Richard, USS Antietam, USS Boxer, and USS Lake Champlain were joining the fleet, 4 Essex-class carriers commissioned in a single calendar year, while Japan struggled to keep one converted hull afloat. The Essex-class would go on to fight in the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and to recover the Apollo astronauts from the Pacific. But the ledger that mattered closed in 1944. The Japanese counted what they were facing, and they wrote it down. At Leyte Gulf in October 1944, the Imperial Navy made its last serious attempt to interfere with the American carrier force, and threw away the 4 carriers it still had in commission: Zuikaku, the last veteran of Pearl Harbor, and 3 of the converted light carriers, as decoys, with almost no aircraft aboard, just to draw Halsey's Third Fleet north and away from the landings. Halsey took the bait, sank all 4 decoy carriers in a single afternoon, and the Imperial Japanese Navy as a carrier force ceased to exist that day. From October 25, 1944 onward, every carrier versus carrier engagement of the Pacific War was won by default. The empire that had begun the war with 10 carriers ended it with none worth the name. The astonishment, looking back, is not just the number of ships. It is the calmness of the system that produced them. There was no dramatic surge, no one program rushed to a finish. There were 5 yards building 24 of the same ship to the same drawings, day after day for 4 years, while a country across the ocean tried to answer with one. The lesson the Imperial Navy learned at the Marianas was not really about pilots or tactics or radar, although all of those mattered. It was about arithmetic. The United States had begun building its 1944 fleet in 1941. Japan had not. When the carriers of the Essex-class steamed in line off Tokyo Bay in September 1945, the men on their flight decks were standing on a deck that had been laid down in a country the Empire of Japan, on the day Pearl Harbor burned, still believed it could outproduce. The miscalculation cost the Empire the war. The carriers that proved it were not the ones the Americans had on December 7, 1941. They were the ones the Americans had already started building.